I'm going to talk for 15 or 20 minutes. And you see the title, A Pandemic, Recession, and Policy Responses, Early Thoughts. I want to emphasize the point about early thoughts because I've just been trying to put my own thoughts together in the last few days about how to think about all of this. So let me start by talking about what a normal recession looks like. Recessions are not all exactly the same, but most recessions don't look like this one. So here's what I think of as a normal recession. Most normal recessions actually have a small, you might be surprised to hear me say that, but a small reduction in aggregate demand. If you think about overall aggregate demand being 100, a typical reduction might see a reduction in aggregate demand by 3 or 4%. That's a typical or a normal recession. Typically, it's a decline in investment. So investment is, as you know from the macro class, the most volatile part of aggregate demand. So typically, there's a large decline in investment. There's a decline in the consumption, in particular of durable goods. What we usually see in a recession is that confidence is quite shaken, and that shaken confidence is mostly what is behind those declines in investment and consumption. So firms are seeing a lot of uncertainty, their confidence is shaken, so this is a great time not to be borrowing to expand their plant and equipment. And households are maybe worried about losing their jobs, so this is a good time not to be embarking on large purchases. Some recessions see supply chain issues, okay, and credit issues, or credit issues. So for example, the 2008-2009 global financial crisis was a recession that was started by a financial crisis. And that's already a little bit different than your typical recession. But in that recession, we saw credit really seize up. And credit is a very important input to the production process. As I said in class, you should think about the flow of credit like the flow of electricity. And when it really ceases to flow, then production really ceases as well. So some recessions have that. What typically happens in a normal recession is that employment losses, so as output declines, typically employment declines in a pretty similar percentage, and I'll say more about that later. But employment losses in a typical recession are concentrated. It is not the case that if you have a recession where GDP falls by 3%, it is not the case that everybody experiences a 3% decline in income or a 3% decline in hours worked. What's much more likely is that 90% of people who are working still work, but 5% of people who are working get laid off. And so those employment losses become highly concentrated. And because they're highly concentrated, they are a very important public policy problem. Another way to say this is if in fact the 3 or 4% decline in the 2008-2009 recession in Canada had GDP fall by 3.2%, and I'm going to come back to that number as well. 3.2% was the decline in GDP in Canada in 2009. That was a big recession, 3.2%. But that 3.2% in terms of job loss was focused on a relatively small group of people. And that's why recessions matter. If in fact it was spread evenly around everybody and everybody's income went down by 3%, we wouldn't get so excited about it. But those employment losses and the income losses tend to be concentrated on a much smaller share of the population, and that makes it a much bigger public policy problem. Okay, what does the normal policy response look like following a normal recession? Well, typically it's all about increasing aggregate demand, and you're trying to restore aggregate demand, or at least part way to where it was, but also getting people back to work. You're trying to increase employment. So what do? Well, you can have fiscal stimulus. So you have government increases their spending. Typically, you're increasing government purchases on things like infrastructure projects. Because infrastructure projects, at least some of them, can start fairly quickly. They use a lot of domestic materials, and they have a multiplier effect that actually increases spending in other parts of the economy and therefore gets people back to work. Sometimes governments will introduce tax reductions. These tend to be limited because when governments introduce temporary tax reductions, because they tend to be temporary tax reductions when you're faced with a temporary recession. Quite often people just save them. They don't spend them, and so they end up not being very effective as a stimulus measure. So that's what fiscal stimulus looks like in a nutshell. Then, of course, there's monetary stimulus. So central banks get into the act, they lower the interest rates. And the whole point of monetary stimulus is that you're lowering the interest rates and you're trying to actually get firms and households to borrow money. You're actually encouraging them to borrow money so that businesses will borrow money to expand their facilities, or households will borrow money to build a house or buy a house, get a mortgage, or buy a new car. What you're trying to do is actually increase investment plans and consumption plans. As happened in 2009, for the first time in recent history, you may also introduce unconventional policy measures or monetary policy, which basically means that you can't do anything more on short-term interest rates, but you print money like it's going out of style and then use that freshly printed money, electronic or physical, to buy assets. And typically you're buying assets in the form of government bonds. I do want to say now, all of my students have heard me say this, but what we started calling unconventional monetary policy in terms of printing money and buying government bonds is deeply conventional. This is what central banks have always done since the creation of central banks. This is what they do. It's what probably they will always do. But what was really unconventional about monetary policy and this printing of money to buy assets was the scale on which it happened. Because the balance sheets of the central banks that did this, in particular the Federal Reserve and the European Central Bank, they doubled and tripled and quadrupled over a period of 4 or 5 or 6 years, when in normal life and normal times, they would have been expanding at the rate of 5 or 6% per year. So that was what was really unconventional. So that's what a normal policy response looks like, and then bridging into the unconventional, but still kind of a normal recession. And if there was a financial crisis aspect to this, you also see policies designed to assist credit flows, to keep credit flowing through financial markets. All right, so what does a pandemic recession look like? This is actually a very different beast. I think the first way you want to think about a pandemic recession is that there's a large reduction in aggregate supply. Aggregate supply, not aggregate demand, first and foremost. I'll talk about aggregate demand in a second. But the real point of large reduction in aggregate supply is that you've got a bunch of workers who are now either choosing to stay at home, or they are required to stay at home. And so they are effectively, dropping out of the effective workforce. Now, some people can work from home. Many workers cannot work from home, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later. But basically, once you've got people that are staying at home to self-isolate during a public health crisis, then you've got, your supply of labor has basically dried up, or hugely, to a large extent, it is dried up. And so that is a big negative supply shock to the economy. So a whole bunch of stuff that could have been produced is now not being produced. That disrupts supply chains. So now there's even a firm that is still trying to produce stuff for which there's a demand, like there's a demand for hand sanitizer, but in fact, the firms that are producing hand sanitizer may have a hard time doing so because the things they need have been disrupted and are not available in the supply chain because a lot of workers in those supply chains aren't workers. Now, there's also a reduction in aggregate demand, okay? And what I mean by this is I don't mean workers who aren't working and therefore have no income aren't spending. That's also true. But just to be geeky for a moment, that's actually the shift of the aggregate supply curve and moving up an aggregate demand curve. What I'm talking about here is actually a reduction in aggregate demand, even coming from those entities whose income has not changed. So we've got confidence that is shaken. So here I am at home. I'm actually still being paid. I'm working from home, but I'm not going out for dinner. I'm not buying airplane flights. I'm basically not buying anything. So my demand for a whole bunch of goods and services has shrunken, even though my income has not changed. That's a leftward shift in the aggregate demand curve. This time, So it didn't have to happen this way, but the decline in activity globally has reduced the demand for oil, and that has pushed down the world price of oil. But also, we have, as you probably read, we have Russia and Saudi Arabia actually having a bit of an output game and actually trying to oversupply the market for oil because their budgets, in particular Saudi Arabia's budget, is so tightly connected to the world price of oil that they have an incentive to keep pumping it like crazy, and it's driving the price down. So the price of oil has plummeted, which for Canada is a aggregate demand shock. It's a negative aggregate demand shock. For other countries that don't produce oil, it's actually a good thing. But for Canada, who's a net producer, a net exporter of oil, that decline in the world price of oil is a negative aggregate demand shock. There's also, of course, been a decline in stock markets. Now, there's dual causality here. The stock market is very much a forward-looking asset market. So participants in the stock market are looking at the economic collapse, and they are imputing, they're kind of figuring out what is the decline in profits and decline in activity associated with that decline, and therefore what is the decline in the value of the companies whose shares they hold. So part of the decline in the stock market is reflecting the decline in economic activity. But also, as wealth declines from the stock market, and it's declined by about 35% in the past 2 or 3 weeks, then people who might consume some fraction of that are actually demanding less. Estimates from the IMF have been that what's called the marginal propensity to consume out of stock market wealth is about 3 or 4%. So if there's a $100 billion decline in the value of the stock market, then there's about a $4 billion decline in aggregate demand that comes from that. So as I said, dual causality here. The stock market decline is reflecting the economic collapse, but it's also adding to the decline in aggregate demand. Well, so what's the appropriate policy response if you're hit with a pandemic recession? Well, the first thing you want to do is not restore employment. That's the goal. Don't restore employment because we don't want people going back to work. So this is completely new territory for central bankers and finance ministers around the world. Generally, this is not the kind of recession we get hit with. And so your typical stimulus package, which is designed to increase economic activity and put people back to work, is not what you want. What you want to do is you want people to be able to stay home so they can self-isolate, so you can prevent the spread of the pandemic, and so the ones that actually are sick can get healthy. What that means, though, is that fiscal policy should probably focus on providing income relief. So I like to make the distinction between relief and stimulus. What we're trying to do with fiscal policy isn't put people back to work by building bridges and building other infrastructure. We're actually trying to provide income relief, or we should be trying to provide income relief for those people who are stuck at home and they're unable to actually earn income. If you're stuck at home like me, that's not the problem. I'm stuck at home, but I'm working from home and I'm still, at least for now, receiving my income. So I'm not the problem. But some people, actually, if they're stuck at home, they can't work and they're not going to be getting their income. Monetary and credit policy should probably focus on providing credit or improving credit conditions, which is one of the problems with supply chains. So firms whose supply chains have been disrupted and whose revenue has dried up might need access, almost certainly need access to credit, and that's difficult. And so monetary and credit policy should probably focus on that. The reason why I think monetary policy need not focus on lowering interest rates in the traditional way is that we're not trying to get people to increase investment demand and the demand for consumption of durables on, buying things on borrowed money. Their problem isn't that interest rates are too high. Their problem is that they don't want to buy things because they're faced with uncertainty and that they're stuck at home. And so not all of these actions in terms of improving credit conditions are going to fall on the central bank, and we're going to see some examples soon. Here is a view that you may or may not agree with, but I think it's largely correct. Robert Reich used to be the labor secretary under Clinton. Very smart guy. He is on the macro reading list, I think also on the micro reading list. He's in the public policy school at Berkeley. So what does he say here? No industry, not airlines, not hotels, not cruise ships should be bailed out. They can stay in business by borrowing at rock bottom rates, using their assets as collateral. Taxpayer money should be used to bail out people, not corporations. I think that's reasonable. I mean, you might disagree. I actually think that's a pretty reasonable position. One thing is that financial markets may not be as perfect as Robert Reich seems to be suggesting here. So a small business may go to a bank to borrow based on their healthy assets, and the bank may say no. Banks, at least in Canada, are pretty famously conservative, and they don't really like to take on a lot of risks, which is why we sometimes have government financial crown corporations like BDC that are in the market lending money to small and medium-sized enterprises that actually can't sometimes get credit from commercial banks. Okay, let me talk a little bit about the pandemic, about the likely magnitude of what we are now entering. And I really want to emphasize here that these really are preliminary thoughts for me. And when you see my numbers, you may conclude, as I did, that I've done something wrong with my numbers because they're just too big. All right, I'm going to make up some numbers and I just end up with too big a recession, so we can talk about this. But what I want to do is consider the percentage of people who cannot work. So consider basically the percentage decline in, let's say, paid employment, okay? So there are people who can work from home. These kinds of people, professors, lawyers, accountants, architects, financial planner types, a lot of these kinds of people can work from home because basically as long as they have a computer and they have access maybe to their database or to their hard drive at work, they can continue working, at least for a while, okay? They may not be able to work for a year from home, but they can probably work successfully for a few weeks or for a month or maybe even a couple of months. But there are a whole bunch of people who cannot work from home. You think about people that are in retail establishments. That, by the way, is the #1 job for women in Canada, people who work in retail establishments. How about people who work in the transport sector? If you're driving cars or driving trucks, that happens to be the #1 job for men in Canada, all right? I'm not saying the majority of workers, it's just the #1 single most common job. If you are working on an assembly line or in a manufacturing facility, you might be laid off. Who was it just laid off 5,000 workers? Air Canada just laid off 5,000 workers. Cirque du Soleil, actually not manufacturing, just laid off 95% of its workforce, okay? Local services, think about hair salons, restaurants, dry cleaners. All of those ones may be shut down and those people basically can't work from home, or most of them can't work from home. Construction, if it shuts down, you can't work, do that from home. Teachers, I used to think that teachers couldn't work from home, but here I am, I'm a professor and I'm working from home. I was just speaking to a friend last night in Winnipeg who said that somebody was a friend of hers, child in grade 2 was having a class delivered by Zoom. So I guess some teachers can work remotely. The hospitality industry, hotels, restaurants, etc. You basically can't do that work from home. Well, that's a lot of workers who can't work from home. And so if they're laid off, or even if they're not laid off, but they're just told to go home for 2 weeks or 4 weeks or 6 weeks, chances are they're not going to be receiving their income. And even if they are receiving some income, they're not producing. And remember, GDP is actually about whether stuff gets produced. So here is where I'm going to make up some numbers, okay? So these are all hypothetical numbers, but they are also, I think, kind of reasonable. I'm going to put question marks all over the place here, just so that you know that I know that I am spitballing here, but I'm going to try to spitball in a bit of a structured way. So I want to give you 3 scenarios and then 1 real life comparison. And all of these numbers here are about the percentage of decline in employment from the last quarter of last year, okay? So scenario one is my optimistic scenario. So look at the first cell here. It's 3% employment decline averaged over the quarter. So a quarter is 3 months, January, February, and March. The three numbers below three, the ones in parentheses, are showing you the monthly numbers. And then the upper number is the average of those. So if you had 0, 0, and then a 10% decline in March, that gives you basically a 3% average for the quarter, okay? So all of my scenarios, as you'll see, have this, because I think that's probably in the ballpark of what it is. I think we had basically no employment decline from coronavirus in January and February, but we're gonna have some small employment decline, something like 10% with people staying at home. I'm making up that number, but I think it's in the ballpark. So it gives us a 3% average. Now look at quarter two. So that is the quarter that we are just about to start. That's April, May, and June. Well, I don't know, but this is my sense of optimistic. A 40% and then 30% and then 20% decline in employment. So that means 40% of workers staying home and not being able to work from home, 40%. So why do I think that's optimistic? Well, you'll see in comparison with the next two scenarios. But that gives you an average of 30. And then partly why this is an optimistic scenario is that I'm assuming that by the time we get to June, April, May, June, by the time we get to July, the beginning of the third quarter, we are back to normal. So we're back to normal for the third quarter and the fourth quarter of 2020. If you do the math on this, which is nothing more than a weighted average, you get a decline in GDP for 2020 of 8.25%. So where's that coming from? Well, it's a 30% decline, basically. If 30% of the people are staying at home, then basically 30% of the people aren't producing. So you're losing 30% GDP in that quarter, but that's only 1 quarter of the year. So you take 1 quarter of that, and that's how you get the 8.25% decline. That's a big decline. Now, I don't know whether you think that second quarter number, those second quarter numbers are optimistic or super optimistic or quite pessimistic. I don't know. So this is why I'm putting the question mark on that. But 8.25% decline for the year which is basically all coming from the second quarter, is a big decline. Well, you can see what's going to happen now. A moderate, so that's worse than optimistic, have the same thing in the first quarter, but the second quarter now is worse. It's a 50%, 40% to 30%. So things are getting really bad in April and then gradually getting better through May and June. And then it lasts into the third quarter, but it's still getting better, 30%, 25, 20. And then it's still there for the fourth quarter, 2010. And finally, by the end of the fourth quarter, it's back to normal. Well, that's a 19.5% decline in GDP. That's really big, okay? Really big by historical standards. So then we get to pessimistic. Again, the same thing for the first quarter. Now the second quarter is really bad, 70%, 70, 60, 50, then 40, 30, 20 with an average of 30, then 20, 10, 0. So all of these scenarios, life gets back to normal by the time we get to 2021. That's a 25% decline. Just so you know, the Great Depression in Canada had GDP fall by 30%, 30%, 30, between 1929 and 1932, okay? GDP fell by 30%. As I said early on, your typical recession these days is GDP falling by 3% or 4% or 5% if it's really bad. All of these scenarios are worse than that, okay? The last thing is the actual data from the 2008-2009 crisis. The actual data is over the quarters of 2009, we saw employment fall by those numbers, 2%, 2.5, 3%, and then it started to get a little bit better. And 2009 had a GDP decline, an actual GDP decline of 3.2%, okay? Notice that the GDP decline is larger than the employment loss. This is actually to be expected, because employment, labor, is only one of kind of the two main factors of production. Physical capital also matters. And so actually what you should expect if you kind of think about an aggregate production function, and so with that language, my macro students are starting to, go back into trauma. But if you think about an aggregate production function, if you have a bunch of laid off workers and a bunch of laid off physical capital, idle physical capital, then both of them are going to account for the employment loss. So what you'd expect actually is that the employment loss should be slightly larger than, the GDP loss should be slightly larger than the employment loss. That's what we saw in 2009. What that tells you for my numbers, my hypothetical numbers, is that the GDP numbers could actually be larger than those employment loss numbers. Final click on this page. Yesterday, I was looking at JP Morgan's forecasts for GDP growth for various countries of the world, including China. Their forecast for China in the first quarter of 2020 was 40.8%. That is shockingly similar to my number of 40% in the moderate scenario. And China is basically 1 quarter ahead of us, okay? Maybe they're not quite a quarter, maybe they're 2 months ahead of us. But I think their first cases were in the mid-December, and we're now 3 months into them. So maybe we're 2 months ahead of them. That's almost a quarter. So when I saw that number, I started to think, well, maybe that moderate scenario, maybe it's realistic. So just to repeat, I was depressed by this exercise. And I'd like to know that I've done something fundamentally wrong in my thinking. And so I'm certainly open to being convinced that I have done something fundamentally wrong, but I can't see what I've done that's wrong. Okay, let me talk about policy responses, and I'll try to be quick, and then I'll open it up for questions. What have we seen so far in monetary policy? Well, the Bank of Canada and the US Fed have both had 2 rate cuts in the last week or so. 100 basis points, that's 1 full percentage point for Canada, 150 basis points for the Fed. They've also extended credit to financial institutions. I actually think that extending credit to financial institutions is probably the more important thing here than simply the rate cut. As I said before, I don't think firms are not borrowing money because interest rates are too high. So I think it's unlikely that a simple interest rate cut is going to stimulate aggregate demand. But to the extent that credit markets are disrupted, making sure that banks and frankly other corporations are liquid is probably a very good idea. The European Central Bank is going big or going home, folks. They have just introduced yesterday a pandemic emergency purchase plan, PEPP. They have said 1,100 billion euros, 1 trillion euros, they will be purchasing assets. So they are expanding their balance sheet in a very unconventional way, as they did, by the way, during the last several years, but they're now going on another round of asset purchases. And those will directly inject money into the financial system and then hopefully be lent out if people want to borrow it. Christine Lagarde, the president of the ECB, has also introduced forward guidance. Forward guidance is a fancy term that says, here's my commitment that I am going to do lots of stuff in the future. Christine Lagarde said, there are no limits to our commitment to the euro. We are determined to use the full potential of our tools within our mandate. She has basically said the ECB will do anything it has to do. And so we can probably expect more of this policy in the future if things continue to look grim. Credit policy, what have we seen? In Canada, as I go on here, I'm going to narrow the focus to Canada. OSFI is the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions in Canada. Jeremy Rudin is the Superintendent of Financial Institutions. This is the bank regulator. So in the Bank of England, for example, the Bank of England actually is the regulator of commercial banks, but that's not true in Canada. So what they have done is they've reduced what's called a domestic stability buffer. Think about this as a capital ratio. This is a special part of the capital ratio that they had imposed on banks to make sure that in the presence of losses in assets, they were that much further away from insolvency. What they've done is that, okay, you can actually reduce this stability buffer, and basically that allows commercial banks to increase their lending. BDC and EDC, these are two of the financial crown corporations, Business Development Bank of Canada and Export Development Canada. They have been basically mandated to increase their lending to small and medium-sized enterprises, again, directly addressing problems in the credit market. And back to the ECB, that $1,100 billion special asset purchase plan includes, for the first time ever in the ECB, corporate securities. It also includes, for the first time ever, Greek government debt. That's a different story. But it includes purchasing corporate securities. So this is the central bank now purchasing private sector debt. So just imagine, Volkswagen issuing debt or Siemens issuing debt. And now what we've got is the central bank purchasing this debt and putting it on its balance sheet. So this is an interesting feature. This is really to the extent that that money is going to go into circulation, it is going to increase the money supply in Europe, but it's also propping up specific parts of the credit market. If the central bank jumps in to purchase corporate debt, then it's keeping that corporate debt market liquid, and that means private entities are going to be more likely to buy that debt, and that means those corporations are more able to issue debt and to borrow short-term if they want to, again, addressing the credit issues. Fiscal policy, I'll just talk about Canadian fiscal policy. We saw this introduced 2 days ago, an $82 billion relief package, which is 3.6% of GDP. This has basically two big components. 55 billion of it is deferred taxes. So this is not giving money to people. This is deferring your taxes until September. So instead of paying taxes, corporate or individual, in April, as when it would ordinarily be paid, a bunch of these taxes won't have to get paid until September. So that is, don't think of that as direct relief. It's really more direct liquidity relief. It's basically allowing people to be more liquid now if they've got a credit access problem, but they're still going to have to pay that money when September rolls along. 27 billion is direct support to individuals and households. Some of it is for people caring for sick family members. Some of it is for people that are forced to stay home and that don't have access to employment insurance. Some of it is a one-time access to the Canada Child Benefit. Think about 27 billion, that's 1.2% of GDP, but if most of that 1.2% gets funneled into, let's say, 1/4 of the economy, let's say Q2, then that 1.2% of annual GDP ends up being something like 4.8% of GDP in that quarter. That's still actually fairly small relative to the numbers that I was showing you. And so my prediction is that unless my math is completely wrong, my prediction is that these sorts of measures will increase in the near future. I think the government will actually step in. The federal government will step in and do more. And from a fiscal capacity point of view, there's lots of room. This package is going to increase the measured deficit in this year by something like 3% of GDP. The federal government's current debt to GDP ratio is about 31%. So that'll push it up to 34 or maybe 35%. No big deal. It'll be interesting to see what the Conservatives say about this. But as the finance minister says accurately, the federal government, the Canadian government's balance sheet is the envy of the G7. It's in great shape, and they've got room to do more on this front if they want. Keep in mind, final word, that relief and stimulus are different things. So relief is about getting money to people who need it now. It's not about getting them back to work. Stimulus is really about increasing production and increasing employment. And I actually think the federal government has seen this difference, recognized this difference, and I'm actually pretty happy with what they've done, although I do think they're going to do more.